You suffer, and you try to hide it. But what if pain isn't a mistake in life? What if suffering is actually the way existence works? Maybe pain is the cost of being conscious. Most people run from that. Only a few have the courage to face it. In this video, you're going to understand why suffering is at the center of the human experience, and why looking that truth in the eye can change the way you live. There are truths that, no matter how hard they are, echo across every culture and every era. And one of them is this: suffering is part of being human. It doesn't matter where you were born, what you believe, how old you are, or what you've been through. Sooner or later, you will face pain. Philosophy, both in the East and the West, has recognized this not as a mistake, but as a fundamental reality of existence. Let's start in the East with Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, who gave us one of the most powerful and profound ideas in the history of human thought. Dukkha, the sense of dissatisfaction or suffering, sits at the heart of life. Buddha teaches this through the Four Noble Truths, and the very first one feels like a punch to the chest. Life is suffering. But wait, he wasn't saying that out of pessimism or hopelessness. For him, recognizing this truth is the first step toward freedom. Suffering, according to Buddha, is everywhere. In birth, in sickness, in aging, in death, in loss, and in unmet desire. We suffer because we cling to what is temporary. We want good things to last forever. We fear losing what we love, and we crave what we don't have. We live in a constant fight against change, against time, against reality itself. The root of suffering is attachment, Buddha said, and with that, he wasn't calling us to become cold or indifferent. He was pointing to liberation. Detachment is not the same as not loving. It's loving without trying to own. It's accepting impermanence as part of life. When we understand that everything is temporary, including us, suffering changes shape. It doesn't vanish, but it loses its power to control us. That is what Buddha calls nirvana, not a paradise, but the end of craving, the end of blind desire that traps us in suffering. On the other side of the world, centuries later, the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer came to a strangely similar conclusion, but with a much darker tone. For Schopenhauer, the essence of the world is the will, an irrational, blind, and relentless force that shows up everywhere, in nature, in animals, and in human beings. In us, this will becomes desire, impulse, constant need. And that's the problem. To desire is to suffer. We are always chasing something. When we get it, boredom shows up. When we don't get it, frustration takes over, and the cycle never ends. For Schopenhauer, life is a pendulum swinging between pain and boredom. Pleasure is only a temporary pause in pain, never its true end. He wrote, "A man's life swings like a pendulum between pain and boredom. There is no real salvation in the world of the senses. The only way to reduce suffering, according to him, would be through denying the will, something very close to what Buddhism teaches through detachment. Art, aesthetic contemplation, and compassion can give us moments of escape from the will's grip, but never completely." Schopenhauer read Buddhist and Hindu texts and deeply connected with them. But unlike the Buddha, he didn't believe in full liberation, only partial relief. His philosophy is a call for clarity, to see the world as it is, not as we wish it were. But if Buddha and Schopenhauer see suffering as something built into existence itself, St. Augustine, one of the greatest Christian thinkers, offers a different lens: suffering as a moral and spiritual consequence. For Augustine, suffering entered the world through original sin. It wasn't part of God's original plan. Pain, fear, death, these things appear as a result of humanity's fall. Adam and Eve, by disobeying God, broke the original harmony of creation. Since then, we have lived separated from God, and that separation is marked by suffering. But for Augustine, suffering isn't only punishment, it is also a reminder. It reminds us that something is broken, that we are not complete on our own, and that we need redemption. Pain, in this sense, pushes us toward God. It forces us to recognize our weakness, our limits, and our dependence on the divine. He writes in Confessions, "Our hearts are restless until they rest in you." That restlessness is the existential suffering of someone who has moved away from the source of goodness. So the path out of suffering, in Augustine's view, isn't just detachment or contemplation, but grace, the return to communion with God. Here we have three different views that still meet at one essential point. Suffering is inevitable as long as we live in this world. Buddha invites us to recognize the cycle of pain and rise above it through wisdom. Schopenhauer forces us to face the harshness of existence and the illusion of desire. St. Augustine reminds us that pain has deep spiritual roots and that it can become a road back to something sacred. And these ideas aren't just distant theories, they speak directly to real life. Who hasn't felt the weight of a desire that never came true? Who hasn't suffered through loss, change, uncertainty? How many times has suffering forced us to think about what actually matters? And here's a truth that runs through all of them. Pain can be a teacher. Yes, it hurts, but it also reveals. It tears down illusions. It confronts us with reality, and it reminds us that we are vulnerable, temporary, human. The question isn't whether we're going to suffer. That part is guaranteed. The real question is, what are we going to do with that suffering? Are we going to deny it, run from it, or face it like a mirror, like an invitation to change? When we listen to these voices, Buddha, Schopenhauer, Augustine, we're being asked to reflect not on how to completely erase pain, but on how to live with it, through it, and maybe even beyond it. Each of these thinkers offers a path. None of them are easy, but all of them point to the same destination, a life that is more awake, more honest, more conscious. So the next time suffering knocks on your door, maybe you'll remember these words. And instead of only asking, "Why me?" you might ask something else. What is this suffering trying to show me? Not all pain is punishment. Sometimes it's revelation. Sometimes suffering is the doorway that forces us to let go of illusions and finally look straight at who we really are. Across different philosophical and spiritual traditions, there's a powerful and unsettling idea. Suffering may not only be unavoidable, it may also be transformative. Yes, pain can break you down, but it can also cleanse you. It pulls you out of your comfort zone and forces you to reflect, to change, to grow. And some of the greatest minds in human history understood this as a necessary process for wisdom, enlightenment, and inner truth. Let's start with one of the giants of Russian literature and spiritual thought, Leo Tolstoy. Tolstoy wasn't just the author of masterpieces like War and Peace and Anna Karenina. He went through an intense existential crisis and spiritual search where suffering took on a completely new meaning. In his book, A Confession, he describes how, at the peak of his fame and wealth, he was hit by an overwhelming emptiness, an anxiety so deep it made him question the entire purpose of life. And at the very bottom of that abyss, Tolstoy discovers something unexpected. Suffering purifies him. He realizes that pain connects him to a deeper truth about existence, a truth that isn't found in books or in the world's glory, but in humility, compassion, faith, and love for others. Tolstoy writes, "The only true life is living for others." For him, suffering is what destroys pride, selfishness, and the illusion of control. It opens the heart to the pain of other people and awakens moral and spiritual awareness. It's no coincidence that Tolstoy moved closer to a simple life, almost like a peasant, defending non-violence and a living, practical kind of faith. In his view, suffering is also seeing. It's realizing we are not the center of the world. It's stepping outside yourself to meet another person. It's breaking the ego to make room for love. This idea of suffering as a tool for moral growth also appears very clearly in the Chinese tradition through the teachings of Confucius. For Confucius, the greatest goal of human life is the cultivation of virtue, the lifelong effort to become a morally strong, fair, and wise person. But that doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't come from quick formulas. Building character requires self-awareness, discipline, and inevitably, overcoming pain. Confucius teaches, it's not what happens to us that matters, but how we respond to it. In that way of thinking, suffering is like a strict teacher, harsh but necessary. It teaches resilience, humility, patience. It forces us to look at our mistakes, our limits, and the impact our actions have on the world around us. In Confucian ethics, nobody is born fully virtuous. Moral excellence is built through effort, and pain is part of that process. Someone who has never suffered may have never been truly tested, and without tests, there is no solid virtue. Confucius valued suffering not as an end, but as a means, a path that makes us examine life, recognize our flaws, and grow. That's why the truly wise person, in his view, doesn't run from suffering. He accepts it as part of the road. But maybe the most intense and even provocative view on this topic comes from one of the boldest philosophers in the West, Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche flips almost everything the Western tradition had said about suffering. He rejects the idea that pain is punishment or that it should be avoided at all costs. To him, suffering is a condition for becoming stronger, freer, and more real. Nietzsche says, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger." That line is often used in a shallow way, but its philosophical weight is much deeper. For Nietzsche, suffering is the fuel of inner growth. It confronts us with our limits and forces us to decide who we are and who we want to become. He proposes an ideal, amor fati, the love of fate. That means accepting everything that happens in your life, including pain, not with resignation, but with affirmation. Loving what is. Embracing even suffering as an essential part of your own journey. Nietzsche writes, "Become who you are." But that process is not comfortable. It's a struggle, a crossing. And in that crossing, suffering is not an obstacle. It's the raw material that shapes the soul. Anyone who runs from pain is also running from themselves. When we look at these three perspectives, Tolstoy, Confucius, Nietzsche, one thing becomes clear. Suffering is not only inevitable, it is shaping us. Tolstoy sees pain as a path towards spirituality and love for others. Confucius sees suffering as a chance to become more ethical and aware. And Nietzsche challenges us. If you don't suffer, you don't grow. If you don't embrace pain, you don't become free. But here's an important point. That doesn't mean we should seek suffering or romanticize it. None of these thinkers are saying that suffering is good in itself. They're warning us that when pain comes, and it will come, we can choose how we move through it. We can harden and become bitter, or we can use pain as a tool for transformation. And what about you? When was the last time suffering taught you something? Maybe it was the end of a relationship, the loss of someone you loved, the failure of a dream. In moments like that, it feels like the world is collapsing, but something rare can also happen. You get the chance to rethink who you are, to redefine what matters, to grow. That doesn't mean suffering automatically gives life meaning, but it can create space for meaning to be rebuilt. Pain cuts deep, but it can also bring light. These perspectives aren't easy. They demand courage, because they tell us we aren't passive victims of suffering. We are creators of meaning even in the middle of pain. In a world where everything revolves around chasing pleasure, quick success, and constant happiness, these ideas almost feel revolutionary. They call us to something deeper, a life that doesn't run from pain, but learns from it. A life that, when it gets wounded, doesn't just bleed, it transforms. Sometimes the pain we feel isn't in the world, it's inside the mind. It doesn't come from what happens, but from how we think about what happens. And when you change the way you see reality, you also change the way you suffer. This is one of the most powerful ideas in philosophy. Suffering isn't absolute. It can be a construction, an interpretation, an illusion created by a mind that refuses to accept how fluid life really is. Three major thinkers explored this idea deeply, each in their own way. Epictetus through Stoicism, Zhuangzi through Taoism, and Jean-Paul Sartre through existentialism. They offer challenging but freeing perspectives, showing that in many cases it's not reality that needs to change, but the way we relate to it. Let's start with Epictetus, one of the most influential Stoic philosophers of the ancient world. He was born into slavery, lived with physical limitations, and yet reached inner freedom through philosophy. And one of his most famous quotes captures the core of his thinking. It's not things themselves that disturb us, but our opinions about them. For Epictetus, the root of suffering lies in interpretation. Reality can be harsh: loss, failure, illness, rejection. But the suffering we feel isn't directly caused by the facts. It comes from our mental resistance, the way we judge events, the story we build around them. I lost my job. Is that bad? It depends. Maybe it's a chance to change direction. Someone criticized me. Does that destroy me? Only if I believe my value depends on other people's approval. Stoicism teaches us to separate what is under our control from what isn't. We don't control circumstances, but we do control our response. And when we make that distinction, we gain power, because a huge part of our suffering comes from the pointless attempt to control what cannot be controlled. Epictetus isn't asking us to ignore pain. He's asking us to take responsibility for how we deal with it. He wants us to stop blaming the world and start training our thoughts. Suffering then becomes a choice, or at least a space where we have more freedom than we think. This idea that suffering is born in the mind also appears in Taoist philosophy, especially in the writings of Zhuangzi, a master of fluid, poetic, and paradoxical thought. Zhuangzi doesn't say suffering is fake. He says it appears when we resist the nature of things. And the nature of things is change, impermanence, constant transformation. He tells stories that feel like dreams, including his most famous one. Once, he dreamed he was a butterfly, and when he woke up, he asked himself, "Am I a man who dreamed he was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming he is a man?" With that, he shows how reality can shift and how fragile our fixed ideas about the self, about life, and about what is real truly are. Zhuangzi says, "The one who follows the flow of the Tao does not suffer." And what is the Tao? It's the natural path, the spontaneous course of things. We suffer, according to him, because we try to stop the river with our hands. We want to control what can't be controlled. We want everything to stay the same. We want what is alive to be fixed. But life is wind, water, movement. When we resist loss, death, and change, we create suffering. But when we flow with what is, pain starts to dissolve. Not because it disappears, but because the mind stops fighting it. Zhuangzi teaches us to see impermanence as a gift, not a curse. He even invites us to laugh, even at death, because in the end, everything returns to the natural cycle of the universe. And then we find a third thinker who takes this idea into a more modern, more anxious, but equally deep territory: Jean-Paul Sartre, the French philosopher and father of atheist existentialism. For Sartre, suffering is also a construction, but it comes from something else: the radical freedom of the human being. And that is even more unsettling. Sartre says, man is condemned to be free. Condemned because we didn't choose to be free, we simply are. There's no ready-made essence, no manual for life. We're thrown into the world and we have to choose constantly. And that freedom is where suffering begins. Why? Because every choice carries responsibility. Every decision involves giving something up. And we are the only ones responsible for what we do with what life hands us. If life has no built-in meaning, then it's on us to create it, but that's terrifying. So many times, we hide behind excuses. We blame other people, society, fate. But Sartre says no. You are free, and that freedom can hurt deeply. Suffering, then, often comes from mishandling that freedom, from self-deception, from refusing to admit that we are the authors of our own life, from the weight of having to create meaning with no guarantees. And even when everything seems absurd, Like he shows in his play No Exit, hell can be other people, or more precisely, our unresolved relationship with them. Sartre puts us in a brutal game. Either we accept freedom and face suffering as part of building an authentic life, or we live in bad faith, trapped in comforting lies that feel safe but empty. Now think about this for a moment. How much of what you suffer today comes from the facts, and how much comes from the way you interpret them? Maybe it's not the breakup that hurts, it's the belief that I'm not good enough. Or maybe it's not the mistake, it's wounded pride. Maybe it's not what happened, it's the resistance to accepting that it happened. Epictetus teaches us to shift the focus. Don't fight what you can't control. Change how you see it. Zhuangzi invites us to let go of control and flow with life's movement. Sartre challenges us to stop running from freedom and accept that even in suffering, the choice is ours. These ideas don't erase real pain. They don't say life is just a mental game, but they show us that suffering can often come from rigidity, attachment, the illusion of control, and the refusal to take responsibility. And that's good news, because if suffering is built by the mind, it can also be rebuilt. We can change meanings. We can reinterpret loss. We can free ourselves from the prisons we created. It takes courage, no doubt. But maybe the biggest prison isn't what we lived through. It's what we believe about what we lived through. Inside us, there's a powerful force, almost impossible to tame, that pushes us forward. The will to live. It drives us, makes us desire, chase, create. But it also makes us suffer. So what exactly is this will that both builds life and produces anguish? Across different philosophical traditions, this force is often viewed with suspicion, because behind it, there may be a blind impulse, an ego that has lost touch with its true nature, or even a lonely cry in the face of life's absurdity. In this lesson, we're going to explore three very different and surprisingly complementary views on the relationship between suffering and the will to live, through Schopenhauer, Camus, and the Upanishads. We begin with Arthur Schopenhauer, the German philosopher who used pessimism as a lens to understand the world. For him, everything that exists is driven by a force he called the will. But here's the key. This will is not rational, moral, or conscious. It is blind, irrational, relentless, and it sits at the root of all existence. A stone falls because the will drives it. A plant grows from that same impulse. Animals hunt, run, fight to survive. And human beings, we are dominated by that same force. We desire, we crave, we chase, endlessly. And that's where the problem begins. To desire is to suffer, because while we desire, we feel lack. And when we finally get what we want, the satisfaction doesn't last. Soon enough, we want something else. We fall into an endless cycle of frustration, short-lived pleasure, and new craving. Schopenhauer describes it brutally. Life swings between pain and boredom. When we don't have what we want, we suffer. When we do have it, we get bored. For him, the will to live is the root of suffering. So what's the way out? To deny that will, not in the sense of wanting to die, but in the sense of freeing yourself from constant desire. This can happen through art, aesthetic contemplation, ascetic discipline, and especially compassion, because once we recognize suffering as universal, we loosen our grip on the ego. Schopenhauer admired Eastern teachings and believed the path to liberation is closer to letting go of desire than celebrating life. Happiness for him isn't found in wanting more, it's found in wanting less, maybe even wanting nothing at all. This view may sound dark, but it's deeply honest. Schopenhauer doesn't comfort us with illusions. He looks at the world and says, yes, pain is everywhere, but there is wisdom in admitting that, and in searching for a way not to become a slave to the force that beats inside us. But is there a way out? Is life only pain? Or is there still some dignity possible even in the middle of suffering? This is where Albert Camus enters the conversation, with his philosophy of the absurd. Camus also starts from the idea that suffering is inevitable. But unlike Schopenhauer, he doesn't see a blind will behind the universe. For Camus, the world is indifferent. It has no built-in meaning. And we, human beings, are the ones who desperately search for meaning, even when there's no guarantee we'll find it. That conflict, the human thirst for meaning and the silence of the universe, is what he calls the absurd. And from that absurdity, suffering is born. The pain of living in a world that doesn't answer, doesn't explain, and simply is. But Camus makes a radical choice. He doesn't run. He doesn't deny. He doesn't surrender. Instead, he proposes something braver, lucid rebellion. Facing the absurd head-on, without comforting lies, and still choosing to affirm life. He says, "What is a rebel? A man who says no, but refuses to give up." Camus isn't calling us into pessimism, he's calling us into courage. If suffering has no objective explanation, then it becomes a test of dignity. How will we respond to it? In the myth of Sisyphus, Camus presents the image of a man condemned by the gods to push a boulder up a mountain forever. Every time the rock reaches the top, it rolls back down. The task is pointless. And yet Camus ends with a surprising line. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Happy, yes, because Sisyphus is the one who refuses to break. He keeps going. He turns the burden into a choice. He affirms life even without guarantees. For Camus, the will to live shouldn't be denied. It should be faced with clarity, without illusions, and still lived with passion. Finally, we arrive at one of the oldest and deepest traditions in human history, the Upanishads, philosophical and spiritual texts from ancient India that form the foundation of Hindu thought. Here, the relationship between suffering and will is seen from another angle, the problem of mistaken identity. According to the Upanishads, we suffer because we identify with what we are not. We believe we are the body, the thoughts, the desires, the achievements, but all of that is temporary. All of that changes, and anything that is temporary will inevitably produce suffering. The problem isn't the will itself, but ignorance of our true nature. That ignorance is called avidya, forgetting the essence. And that essence, according to the Upanishads, is the Atman, the true self, which is identical to Brahman, the ultimate reality. They say, Tat Tvam Asi. You are that. In other words, you are the absolute. You are the infinite. You are the eternal awareness behind every form. When this truth is realized, suffering falls away. Because we understand that what suffers, the ego, the separate self, was never who we truly are. Liberation here doesn't come from denying the will or rebelling against the absurd, but from a deep realization of unity between the self and the whole. We suffer because we are asleep, and when we wake up, we discover we were never truly separated from the source of peace. In that sense, the will to live, when fueled by ego, creates suffering. But when guided by the awareness of truth, it becomes an expression of wholeness itself. These three views, Schopenhauer, Camus, and the Upanishads, may seem opposite, but they connect through one essential point. Suffering is inseparable from the way we relate to the will. To desire without awareness enslaves us. To desire with clarity humanizes us. And to go beyond desire toward essence frees us. So maybe the real question isn't only why do we suffer, but also, who is suffering inside me? Is it the ego that wants to control everything? Is it the human being searching for meaning? Or is it consciousness that forgot what it really is? Few questions are as old and as current as this one. If God exists, why does he allow suffering? This dilemma has crossed centuries, religions, and cultures, and especially when it comes to unfair suffering, innocent suffering, the kind that hits people who did nothing to deserve it. It forces us to think even deeper. For many, pain is the biggest obstacle to faith. For others, it's exactly through pain that God reveals himself. In this lesson, we'll dive into three intense and very different perspectives on this question: St. Thomas Aquinas, who sees suffering as a divine tool for salvation. Ivan Karamazov, a character from Dostoevsky who confronts God with the suffering of innocent children. And Rumi, a Sufi mystic who understands suffering as a secret language between the human soul and the divine. Let's begin with St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the greatest pillars of Christian theology. For Thomas, God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and above all, perfectly good. So how can the existence of pain be explained? His answer is complex, but full of faith. Suffering has a purpose within God's plan. In his masterpiece Summa Theologica, Thomas argues that God does not desire evil, but allows suffering as a path toward a greater good. Pain, according to him, can be a test of faith, like in the story of Job, who kept trusting God even after losing everything. A tool of purification, helping us detach from earthly attachments. A path of union with Christ, who also suffered and through suffering redeemed the world. Thomas writes, God permits evil so that a greater good may come from it. That doesn't mean every pain is justified or understandable. But in Aquinas' view, suffering is not proof that God is absent. It's proof that there is a mystery beyond human logic. Even when we don't understand, faith calls us to trust that pain has meaning, even if that meaning is hidden. But not everyone can accept that idea so calmly. In Russian literature, we find one of the most powerful challenges ever made against human suffering. It comes from Ivan Karamazov, a character in The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Ivan doesn't deny God directly, but he refuses to accept the world as it is, if this world is the work of a God who allows innocent people to suffer. In one of the most unforgettable moments in the book, Ivan asks, "Why should a child have to suffer so the universe can be balanced?" And he goes further. He says that even if, in the end, everything is explained, even if God has hidden reasons, he would rather return his ticket to this world, because no paradise can justify the scream of a tortured child. That's the breaking point. For Ivan, the suffering of the innocent isn't just a logical problem, it's a moral one. He isn't rejecting God's existence. He's rejecting the idea that a good God would accept the pain of the most fragile as part of a higher plan. Dostoevsky doesn't give a final answer, but he forces us to face a real tension between faith and justice. If God is love, how can he tolerate so much pain? And if redemption exists, is it worth the suffering of those who never had a choice? This ethical and spiritual challenge remains open, and maybe there's no purely rational answer that can fully solve it. But there is another perspective, one that doesn't explain suffering with logic, but with love. One that doesn't debate God as an idea, but lives him as a real presence. This is the vision of the poet and Sufi mystic Rumi. For Rumi, suffering is a divine call, a secret language God uses to wake us up from the sleep of distraction. He writes, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." In other words, pain is not punishment, it's an invitation to return to our source, our essence, the heart of God. In Sufism, God isn't distant or abstract. God is absolute closeness, present in everything and everyone. But we forget. We get lost in the ego, in the world, in separation. And pain in that sense becomes a reminder. When the heart breaks, it can finally listen. Rumi also says, "You were born with wings. Why do you choose to crawl through life?" Pain makes us look up. It pushes us beyond the surface. When life is easy, it's simple to forget the sacred. But when we lose, when we hurt, when everything collapses, something opens. And there, in the middle of pain, we may find God in a way we never did before. This view is deeply poetic, but also deeply spiritual. For Rumi, suffering is love in disguise. It's God calling us back. There is no punishment, no blame, only the longing for reunion. These three perspectives, Aquinas, Ivan Karamazov, and Rumi, show how deeply suffering and faith are intertwined. Aquinas sees pain as part of a transcendent purpose. Ivan sees it as unbearable injustice. Rumi sees it as God's passionate call. And maybe each of them is right. at different moments in life. When we trust, we may think like Aquinas, God knows what he's doing. When we rebel, we may sound like Ivan, this can't be just. And when we fall silent and truly feel, we may become Rumi. Pain is a bridge back to the sacred. Pain will never be easy, and it may never be fully understandable. But each of these visions offers a way to move through suffering with meaning, through faith, through protest, or through love. So the question that remains is, what is suffering trying to say to you? Is it a burden with no explanation, a cruelty with no redemption? Or could it be, no matter how impossible it seems, a chance to reconnect with something deeper than yourself? In a world where suffering is so often minimized, ignored, or turned into statistics, there's a philosophical question that burns like an urgent call. What do we do with someone else's pain? Not our pain, the pain of others. Not the pain that hits us directly, but the pain we see in someone else's eyes. A hungry child, a silenced woman, a stranger on the street, a friend in grief. Ignoring that pain is easy. What's hard is facing it honestly. What's hard is allowing someone else's suffering to change us. But for some thinkers, it's exactly in this encounter with another person's pain that true ethics is born. In this lesson, we're going to explore how Emmanuel Levinas, the Dalai Lama, and Simone Weil saw the suffering of others not as something distant, but as an invitation, or even a demand, for moral responsibility, compassion, and presence. We start with Emmanuel Levinas, one of the great philosophers of the 20th century. A survivor of the tragedies of the Holocaust, he built a philosophy that places the face of the other at the center of morality. For Levinas, ethics doesn't begin with rules or abstract principles. It begins with an encounter, and especially with the encounter of someone who is suffering. He says, "The face of the other obligates me." That one sentence captures his entire idea. When we come face to face with another person's vulnerability, their pain, fragility, need, we no longer have the right to remain neutral. The suffering of the other person lands on us like an unavoidable ethical demand. For Levinas, even before we think, judge, or reason, we have already been touched by the silent cry of the other. The bare face of someone who is suffering breaks our indifference. It doesn't simply ask for help, it calls us. There is no real option to care. We are already involved, and that silent call reveals something essential. We are responsible, even when we don't want to be. Ethics isn't a choice. It's a response. It's responsibility in front of pain that isn't mine, but once I see it, it becomes mine in a deeper way. Levinas takes us to a radical shift. The pain of the other is the origin of ethics. There is no philosophy, religion, or moral system that can justify turning away from the suffering of a human being. This idea echoes strongly in the Buddhist tradition, especially in the teachings of the Dalai Lama, who sees compassion as the foundation of any truly ethical life. The Dalai Lama says, "If you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion." For him, compassion isn't optional or sentimental. It's an active choice to recognize someone else's suffering and do something to ease it. But where does compassion come from? Not from duty, not from fear of punishment. It comes from the awareness that all beings want the same thing, to avoid pain and find happiness. When you truly understand that, the other person stops being a stranger. They become a human brother or sister in vulnerability, and that changes how we relate to the world. Compassion is not feeling sorry for someone. It's recognizing someone else as equal in humanity. The Dalai Lama insists that ethics can't be limited to religion, belief, or moral codes. It has to be universal, and the only real foundation for that universal ethics is compassion, because everyone suffers, everyone fears, everyone loves, and because of that, no one can be ignored. This deep ethical sensitivity is also present in the work of Simone Weil, one of the most unique philosophers of the 20th century. Her life was marked by an intense search for justice, truth, and real presence in the face of the world's pain. For Simone Weil, suffering is an experience of abandonment. When we suffer, she says, we don't only suffer physically, We suffer because we feel alone, invisible, forgotten. She writes, "Love of neighbor in its fullest sense simply means being present." For her, that presence is a sacred act, because in front of someone else's pain, we often don't have answers or solutions, but we do have something that can never be missing: our attention, our care, our listening. Simone Weil believed that in the face of another person's suffering, attentive silence can be more powerful than 1,000 words. She saw true attention, without judgment, as a kind of prayer, a form of radical love. And she lived this. She worked in factories to understand the pain of workers. She fought injustice, poverty, and war, not from a distance, but from the inside. For her, philosophy was never just an idea. It was something you live. To Simone Weil, ethics is born from the ability to bow, almost with reverence, in front of someone else's suffering. Not to feel pity, but to be there, truly there. And this may be one of the strongest ideas in this entire lesson. Being with someone who is suffering is something sacred. Today, in a world full of noise, speed, and distraction, this kind of ethics of care feels forgotten, but it still calls us. Levinas says, "You are responsible for the other." The Dalai Lama reminds us, compassion is the foundation of ethics. Simone Weil teaches us, presence in the face of pain is a divine gesture. 3 paths, 3 voices, 1 single message. Don't close your eyes to someone else's pain, because when you truly recognize another person as someone who suffers, something inside you wakes up too. Ethics stops being a theory. It becomes a living response, a daily choice, a commitment to what is most human. And that choice changes everything. It changes how we listen, how we treat people, how we judge. It changes the way we live. When we think about suffering, it's common to imagine something that traps us, something that steals our peace, limits us, freezes us. But is that all it is? What if, instead of being the opposite of freedom, suffering were actually a test of it? What if, even in pain, we were still free? Free even to choose how we suffer. This idea, which sounds contradictory at first, is explored by 3 thinkers from very different times and traditions: Jean-Paul Sartre, Boethius, and Dogen. Each one, in their own way, suggests that suffering doesn't cancel our freedom, it reveals what we do with it. Let's begin with Jean-Paul Sartre, a 20th century French philosopher and one of the key voices of existentialism. Sartre has a radical idea: the human being is condemned to be free. No matter the situation, no matter the pain, we always have a choice. Even in the middle of suffering, we are responsible for how we respond. That responsibility can feel heavy, even cruel, but it's inseparable from freedom. Sartre writes, "What matters is not what they did to me, but what I do with what they did to me." In other words, even when life hurts us, the way we deal with it still belongs to us. We can rebel, surrender, transform, harden, or grow. There's no fixed essence that defines us. We become what we choose to be based on what we've lived through. In Sartre's view, suffering isn't a destiny that drags us around. It's a place where our freedom gets tested. He doesn't deny pain or try to turn it into something spiritual, but he says, "You're still in charge. You can still give meaning to your pain, or you can refuse to." That takes courage, because accepting that freedom means giving up every excuse. You can't blame the universe, other people, or God. It's always us, standing in front of what happens to us. But this radical freedom isn't only personal. Sartre also connects it to ethical responsibility. If we are free, then we are also responsible for others. And that includes the suffering we cause or prevent in other people's lives. It's an intense and challenging view, one that removes all crutches. But it also offers something huge. Even when everything feels lost, freedom is still ours. And it's interesting to see that this same idea, the idea of an inner freedom that survives even in the hardest situations, also appears in the words of Boethius, a 6th century Roman philosopher who lived a tragic fate. Boethius was wrongly imprisoned, accused of treason, and sentenced to death. But it was in prison, on the edge of execution, that he wrote his most famous work, The Consolation of Philosophy. There, trapped, humiliated, betrayed, Boethius does something remarkable. He refuses to hand his mind over to suffering. The pain is real, but his inner freedom remains untouched. For him, true freedom isn't found in external circumstances, but in the soul's ability to turn toward what is eternal, what is good, what is true. Even behind bars, he tries to contemplate the highest good, something no injustice can take away. Boethius writes, "No miserable thing can shake a spirit that seeks the good." That idea runs through ancient philosophy. The body can be imprisoned, but the soul that knows the truth is free. Physical or emotional suffering doesn't have absolute power over someone who has learned to anchor themselves in something higher, stronger, more essential. Boethius sees freedom as the ability to stay loyal to reason, to goodness, to the order of the universe, even when the world collapses around you. It doesn't erase pain, but it lifts the human being above it. And if Sartre speaks of freedom as choosing in the face of the absurd, and Boethius speaks of freedom as holding on to the good in the face of injustice, Zen master Dogen offers a different perspective: freedom as deep acceptance of impermanence. For Dogen, suffering comes from the illusion that things should last. We want life to stay the same. We want people to stay. We want reality to obey our wishes. But everything changes, everything passes, everything dies, and when we resist that truth, we suffer. True freedom, for Dogen, isn't controlling life. It's flowing with it. He says, to study the way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be awakened by all things. That line, which sounds mysterious at first, reveals something powerful. Our attachment to a fixed, separate, controlling self is the root of suffering. When we let go of that rigid identity, we realize we are part of the flow of existence, and in that flow, even suffering has a place. It comes, it goes, it's part of the dance. Dogen doesn't ask us to reject pain or fight it. He invites us to stay with suffering with full attention, without clinging to it. And when we stop resisting, something strange happens. The pain may still be there, but the prison dissolves. It's freedom born from presence, from letting things be, from letting things go. In Zen, freedom isn't the power to choose in the Western sense. It's the liberation from the ego that wants to control everything. And that includes accepting suffering as a natural part of life, like seasons, like birth and death. These three views, Sartre, Boethius, and Dogen, draw a surprising map. Sartre tells us, you are free, even in pain. Choose what you will do with it. Boethius reminds us, the mind can rise above injustice by anchoring itself in the good. Dogen invites us, let go of the self, accept the flow, find freedom even in suffering. Together, these ideas challenge us deeply, because we live in a culture that tries to avoid suffering at all costs, as if pain were failure and freedom meant doing whatever you want, whenever you want. But maybe true freedom isn't escaping pain. Maybe it's how we live inside it. Maybe we become more free when we stop fighting what's unavoidable and start choosing with awareness, presence, and courage. In the end, the question isn't whether we will suffer. Of course we will. The real question is, who will we become in the middle of suffering? Trapped, rebellious, present? Freedom is in every gesture, every response, every silence. And maybe in that space between what happens to us and how we react, the deepest form of freedom is hiding. Is suffering only a wound? Or can it also be a window to beauty? Does pain have shape, color, rhythm? And could it be that art, instead of denying suffering, is exactly where it finds meaning, or even beauty? In this lesson, we're going to dive into one of the most paradoxical parts of the human experience, the relationship between pain and creation. With Nietzsche, Baudelaire, and Say Shonagon, we discover that suffering doesn't have to be a silent burden. It can become voice, words, image. It can become art. Let's begin with Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher who challenged every established truth, and who may be one of the thinkers who reflected most deeply on the beauty of pain. For Nietzsche, suffering is not something to avoid at all costs. It's a fundamental part of life. There is no creation without chaos, no growth without pain, and no real art without, in some way, passing through the territory of anguish. He writes, "We have art, so we do not die of the truth." That sentence says everything. The world, in its raw harshness, can feel unbearable. Life, in its most naked reality, can feel too heavy. But art enters as transformation. It doesn't erase suffering, it reshapes it into expression. And by doing that, it gives meaning to what once felt like pure chaos. Nietzsche explains this through Greek tragedy, especially through the figure of Dionysus, the god of ecstasy, wine, intoxication, and suffering. For him, tragedy proves that the ancient Greeks didn't run from pain. They celebrated it. They looked at the cruelty of existence and answered with art. Beauty rose out of darkness. And that's what Nietzsche offers us. Art as a way of saying yes to life, even when it hurts. Suffering, when lived deeply, can become the force that pushes us to create, not as escape, but as resistance, as transformation, as affirmation. This idea also appears, though in a more melancholic tone, in the work of the French poet Charles Baudelaire. Often considered the father of modern poetry, Baudelaire was a master at turning pain into language, anxiety into beauty, and decay into art. In his most famous book, The Flowers of Evil, he shows us that suffering, loneliness, boredom, melancholy, everything can become poetic raw material. He writes, "You gave me your mud, and I turned it into gold." Baudelaire lived deeply inside the discomfort of modern life, chaotic cities, broken identities, spirituality in crisis. And in that world, he realized that the artist doesn't run from pain. The artist looks straight at it. He goes into the wound, but doesn't collapse inside it. He pulls beauty from what others refuse to look at. For Baudelaire, melancholy isn't a flaw. It's a refined way of seeing. Those who feel too much, who suffer too much, also see deeper. The sensitivity that hurts is the same sensitivity that creates. And maybe that's why his poetry is so dark, but also so beautiful. Because it shows that art doesn't need to hide suffering in order to be beautiful. It can be beautiful precisely because it reveals it. And now, on the other side of the world, we meet a woman who understood this truth long before Baudelaire, through a delicate, subtle, deeply aesthetic way of seeing. Sei Shonagon, a writer and lady-in-waiting at the Japanese court in the 10th century, is the author of Makura no Soshi, also known as the Pillow Book. It's a personal diary filled with observations about everyday life, the seasons, gestures, scents, emotions. What makes her writing so unforgettable is her ability to notice beauty in what doesn't last. And what is suffering, if not another form of impermanence? For Sei Shonagon, there is beauty in what is about to end, beauty in the moment that slips away, beauty in the soft sadness of a flower fading, in the silence of a rainy day, in the eyes of someone saying goodbye. She writes about things that make the heart beat faster, and many of them carry what we call melancholy. Not a loud, desperate kind of suffering, but a subtle pain, full of meaning, a pain that doesn't paralyze you, but makes you more human. In Japanese aesthetics, this is called mono no aware, a sensitivity to the temporary nature of things. The flower that falls, the youth that passes, the love that doesn't return. All of it reminds us that nothing lasts, and that's exactly why everything is so precious. Sei Shonagon teaches us that pain, when seen with sensitivity, can reveal a hidden layer of beauty, not ideal beauty, not perfect eternal beauty, but fragile, imperfect, real beauty. Just as Nietzsche saw tragedy as a yes to life, and Baudelaire saw melancholy as a doorway to art, Sei Shonagon invites us to find beauty even in the cracks of the world. These three perspectives, so different and yet so close, help us understand that pain doesn't have to be only suffering. It can be expression, it can be language, it can be beauty. And maybe that's why so many works of art are born from pain. Because when everything feels lost, art still gives us a voice. When there are no words, art speaks for us. Nietzsche reminds us that art justifies existence, even when it hurts. Baudelaire shows us that melancholy can be turned into gold. Sei Shonagon whispers that beauty lives in what is temporary, and sometimes in what is painful. So the next time pain comes, maybe you don't have to silence it. Maybe you can listen to it, translate it, create with it, sing it. Because deep down, all true art is a yes to life, even when life wounds you. And maybe, just maybe, that is the deepest form of resistance, turning suffering into beauty. When we talk about suffering, it's natural to think of pain as something intimate, personal, subjective, private. But there's another kind of pain that doesn't come only from existence itself. It comes from injustice, the suffering that could have been avoided, the suffering caused by human cruelty, inequality, exclusion. This is the kind of suffering that screams for justice. But what is justice? Who deserves to suffer? Does anyone deserve it? And when suffering comes directly from injustice, how do we repair it? In this lesson, we're going to reflect on how three major thinkers from different cultures and eras, Plato, John Rawls, and Mosey, understood the deep and complex connection between pain and justice. They offer different answers, but they all agree on one thing. You can't talk about justice without facing the reality of suffering. Let's start with Plato, the great philosopher of ancient Greece. In the Republic, Plato builds a vision of justice that goes far beyond human laws. He's looking for the justice of the soul. And here's a surprising idea. For Plato, the person who commits evil suffers more than the person who becomes a victim of it. Yes, it sounds strange, but his logic is clear. The soul that commits injustice corrupts itself. It loses its inner harmony, its connection to truth and goodness. And for Plato, that inner disorder is the deepest form of suffering. He writes, "It is worse to commit injustice than to suffer it." For Plato, justice isn't just a punishment system, it's a virtue of the soul. A just soul is one where every part of the person, reason, courage, desire, plays its role in balance. When that order breaks, the soul enters conflict, loses integrity, and suffers. That's why suffering, for him, can have a purifying value. When we recognize our mistake, our guilt, our distance from the good, that suffering can push us back toward justice. Plato sees pain not only as punishment, but as a chance for moral healing. He believes the true judge is not the one who condemns for revenge, but the one who allows suffering in order to correct. But of course, this view focuses on the suffering of the unjust, the one who did wrong. So what about the victims? What about people who suffer not because they caused harm, but because they were crushed by an unfair system? This is where the modern philosophy of John Rawls comes in, one of the most important political thinkers of the 20th century. Rawls doesn't focus on the soul like Plato. He looks at the system, society, institutions, rules. His core question is, how do we build a just society? And the answer goes straight through a central idea. Justice must reduce the unjustifiable suffering caused by social structures. Rawls starts from the fact that the distribution of things like money, education, healthcare, and opportunity is never neutral. Some people are born with advantages, others with disadvantages, and that creates suffering, hunger, exclusion, racism, poverty, humiliation. Rawls then proposes what he calls the difference principle. Inequality can only be accepted if it benefits the least advantaged. In other words, social justice isn't treating everyone the same, It's correcting unfair starting points that create avoidable suffering. Imagine you don't know where you'll be born, rich or poor, healthy or sick, male or female. What kind of society would you choose to build? Rawls calls this the original position and the veil of ignorance. The answer, he says, would be a society where no one suffers unfairly because of something they didn't choose. This modern and rational view of justice has a clear ethical focus, preventing pain that could be prevented. If someone's suffering comes from exclusion, lack of access, structural injustice, then society has a moral duty to fix it. Rawls forces us to see that many kinds of suffering are not natural. They are produced, and because of that, they can and should be removed through justice. But this concern for other people's suffering is not new. More than 2,000 years before Rawls, a Chinese thinker named Mozi was already defending a moral philosophy built on the idea that we should avoid causing suffering to anyone without favoritism. Mozi lived in a China shaped by constant wars and deep inequality. In response, he proposed a radical principle, Jian'ai, or impartial love. For Mozi, the core problem of society is favoritism. We love our family, our friends, our group, but we ignore or exploit everyone else. And that selective love becomes the root of collective suffering. He writes, "If everyone loved one another impartially, there would be no suffering in the world." Mozi believed justice begins when we recognize that someone else's pain matters just as much as our own. It doesn't matter whether they're my brother or a stranger. If they suffer, they deserve care. It's a deeply ethical and political idea because it demands that we think beyond ego, beyond tribe, beyond nation. Mozi calls us to a global awareness of suffering. He argues that just actions are the ones that reduce pain fairly, without privilege. That kind of impartiality is hard, of course, but Mozi believed that with moral education and ethical leadership, humanity could move in that direction. So with Plato, Rawls, and Mozi, we get a powerful philosophical triangle. Plato reminds us that suffering can purify, and that doing evil is the greatest suffering of the soul. Rawls shows that justice must eliminate structural suffering and protect the vulnerable. Mozi teaches that someone else's pain matters as much as ours, and that impartial love is the path to a just society. 3 eras, 3 worlds, 3 philosophies, but all of them lead us to the same question. How do we respond to human pain in a just way? Because deep down, justice isn't just a system of rules. It's a moral response to the reality of suffering, a refusal to let pain become normal, a refusal to accept that some people must suffer so others can live well. Maybe that's the essence of justice, refusing to treat suffering as an acceptable price. Some pain has no visible cause. It doesn't come from a specific loss, a clear injustice, or a temporary crisis. It comes out of nowhere, or more precisely, from a strange feeling that nothing really matters. That's what we call the existential void, a sense that life keeps moving but feels hollow, that we live but don't know why, that everything we do, work, school, dreams, relationships, might just be an attempt to cover up the silence of the universe. But what if that emptiness isn't a mistake? What if it's a doorway? What if this encounter with nothingness is exactly what can lead us to clarity, courage, or even liberation? In this lesson, we'll explore how 3 major thinkers from very different traditions, Albert Camus, Martin Heidegger, and Nagarjuna, face the suffering that comes from emptiness. In their own ways, they show us that staring into nothingness can be painful, but also deeply revealing. Let's begin with Albert Camus, the Algerian French philosopher known for his philosophy of the absurd. For Camus, existential suffering appears when human beings search for meaning in a universe that gives no answers. We want order, justice, purpose, but the world stays silent. That clash between our hunger for meaning and the world's indifference is what Camus calls the absurd. And this is important. Camus doesn't say that life itself is absurd. He says the absurd is born in the meeting between us and life. We demand explanations. Life gives us chaos. We want logic. Life gives us death. That creates deep anxiety and suffering. But according to Camus, the response is not to run and not to collapse. The response is revolt, courage, clarity. He writes in The Myth of Sisyphus, "The absurd is born of this confrontation between the human call and the unreasonable silence of the world." And he continues, "There is no fate that cannot be overcome by scorn." Camus uses the image of Sisyphus, the man condemned by the gods to push a stone up a mountain forever, only to watch it roll back down every single time. A cruel punishment? Maybe. But Camus ends with a shocking line. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Happy not because he found meaning, but because he refused despair. He accepted the absurd and still chose life. That is Camus's revolt. Not denying the pain of emptiness, but facing it with dignity. For Camus, suffering reveals the raw truth of existence. But when we face that truth without illusions, we become freer, more human, stronger. That same courage in front of emptiness appears even more deeply in the existential philosophy of Martin Heidegger, one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century. For Heidegger, existential suffering shows up as anxiety, or in German, Angst, and it's not the same as fear. Fear has an object, fear of death, of loss, of failure. Anxiety doesn't. It has no clear target. It arises when we come face to face with nothingness. That experience is disturbing because it pulls the ground out from under us. But for Heidegger, this anxiety is necessary. It breaks the surface-level routine of everyday life and reveals something essential. Existence has no guarantees. We live surrounded by distractions, social roles, and projects, but all of that can collapse. And when it does, we find ourselves staring into the void. And in that exact moment, we can wake up. Heidegger calls this authenticity. When we look into nothingness and accept that we are finite, limited, mortal, we begin to live more truthfully, without masks, without escape, without illusions. He writes in Being and Time, "Anxiety reveals being in the world as world." In other words, anxiety makes us see the world for what it is, unstable, temporary, open. For Heidegger, existential suffering shouldn't be avoided, it should be lived through. Because it's inside this emptiness that we discover who we truly are. Not what people told us we should be, but what we can choose to be in the face of finitude. Like Camus, Heidegger doesn't offer easy comfort, but he offers a key, the clarity that comes when we face nothingness and choose to live consciously. But there's a third view, deeply different, that sees emptiness not as a threat, but as liberation. This is the philosophy of Nagarjuna, a master of Madhyamaka Buddhism in the Mahayana tradition. For Nagarjuna, suffering comes from the illusion that things have a solid, independent, fixed existence. We believe the self is real, the world is stable, and that there's something permanent we can hold on to. But that view is deceptive, and it leads directly to suffering. He presents the concept of shunyata, or emptiness. This means nothing exists independently. Everything exists in relationship to everything else. Nothing is fixed. Nothing is separate. Nothing is absolute. That might sound terrifying. How do you live in a world where everything is empty? But Nagarjuna shows that emptiness is not nihilism, it's wisdom. Because when we understand that nothing is fixed, we also realize that nothing needs to be an object of absolute attachment. Pain, fear, loss, all of these become lighter when we see that they are also impermanent. Emptiness dissolves the ego. It dissolves the idea of my suffering, my pain, my problem. And in that dissolving, something new appears. Compassion, freedom, relief. Nagarjuna writes, "Emptiness is the middle way. Whoever understands emptiness understands the end of suffering." That is the deepest difference between his view and Camus or Heidegger. For Camus and Heidegger, nothingness is the ground of clarity. For Nagarjuna, Nothingness is the ground of liberation itself. Understanding emptiness doesn't erase the world. It transforms our relationship with it. Nothing belongs to us. Nothing lasts. And because of that, we can live with lightness. Camus calls us to courage in the face of the absurd. Heidegger calls us to authenticity in the face of anxiety. Nagarjuna calls us to wisdom in the face of emptiness. 3 ways of dealing with the same experience. The existential void. 3 answers to the suffering that appears when nothing seems to make sense. But all of them point in the same direction. Don't run from the void. Look at it. Step into it. Learn from it. Maybe emptiness doesn't need to be filled. Maybe it needs to be understood. And in that understanding, suffering changes color. It becomes a signal, a path, an invitation. Why do we suffer? It's one of the oldest questions in human history. And when people face it, one idea shows up again and again across different spiritual and philosophical traditions. Maybe the pain we feel today isn't random, but comes from our own past actions. That is the foundation of the concept of karma. But karma isn't punishment. It isn't a fixed destiny. It's a principle of moral cause and effect. Everything we do, say, and even think creates consequences. Those consequences can show up in this life or in others. But the key point is this: we are responsible. In this lesson, we'll explore how 3 different perspectives, Theravada Buddhism, the Hinduism of the Bhagavad Gita, and the medieval Christian thought of Thomas Aquinas, understood suffering through the lens of karma, action, responsibility, and transcendence. Let's start with Theravada Buddhism, the oldest school of Buddhism, found mainly in Southeast Asia. Here, karma is understood as an energy created by intentions and actions. Every action driven by greed, hatred, or ignorance plants seeds of suffering. But actions driven by compassion, wisdom, and detachment create conditions for peace and liberation. In the Dhammapada, one of the most important Buddhist texts, it says, "We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world." This means the suffering we experience may come not only from what we do now, but from what we did in past lives. If in another existence we cultivated destructive actions, it's natural that sooner or later we will face the results, not as punishment, but as a natural outcome. But here's the important part. In Theravada Buddhism, karma is not determinism. The present is always a moment of choice. At every moment, we can plant new seeds. So even if today's suffering is a result of the past, it can also become a chance for transformation. And there's something even deeper. According to the Buddha's teachings, the final goal is not to improve karma, but to go beyond the cycle of karma, called samsara. That happens when we deeply understand impermanence, detachment, and the emptiness of the self. When craving ends, suffering ends, and the cycle of cause and effect that traps us is broken. So karma isn't about guilt, it's about conscious responsibility. And suffering, instead of being unfair, becomes part of a process of learning and purification. In Hinduism, especially in the Bhagavad Gita, karma is also at the center of philosophy, but with a different focus. Here, the emphasis is less on the past and more on how we act in the present. In the Gita, the warrior Arjuna falls into crisis before battle. He doesn't want to fight. He feels torn between duty and the suffering the war will bring. That's when Krishna, his spiritual guide, reveals one of the deepest teachings in Hinduism: Karma Yoga, the path of action without attachment. Krishna says, do your duty with calmness, act, but without attachment to the results. According to this teaching, suffering comes when we act while expecting rewards, outcomes, achievements. We get attached to success, failure, approval, and we become slaves to consequences. But when we act with detachment, focused only on the right action guided by dharma, ethical duty, suffering becomes smaller, not because the circumstances change, but because our relationship to them changes. Karma here isn't just what we do, it's how we do it. It's the quality of intention, the purity of the heart. And the spiritual path doesn't require leaving the world behind. It requires acting within the world with awareness, surrender, and wisdom. The Bhagavad Gita invites us to live in the world without being possessed by it, to act with excellence without being crushed by outcomes. That is the secret of karma yoga. Freedom isn't stopping action. Freedom is acting with inner freedom. And in that way, even suffering becomes lighter, because it doesn't define us, it doesn't trap us. But how does Christianity, with its theology centered on divine grace, deal with the idea of suffering as a moral consequence? This is where St. Thomas Aquinas comes in, the greatest philosopher of medieval Christian tradition, offering a view that both connects with and breaks away from the classic idea of karma. For Aquinas, suffering exists, and often it is a consequence of human sin, individual or collective. But there is no automatic equation between suffering and guilt. He writes, "Not all suffering is punishment, and not all punishment is useless suffering." In Christian theology, God is love and justice at the same time. That means that even though our actions have consequences, God acts with mercy. The logic of karma, action and reaction, is surpassed by the logic of grace. In other words, even if someone has done wrong, forgiveness and salvation are still possible, not because they earned it, but because of divine love. Aquinas also sees suffering as something that can teach, not to destroy us, but to purify, strengthen, and wake us up. Suffering can unite the soul with God, break pride, and grow humility. And more than that, the pain of the innocent and righteous can have redemptive value, just as Christ suffered for everyone. So this Christian view does not deny moral consequences, but it says that above them there is something higher: grace, forgiveness, redemption. And that changes everything, because while karma works through the logic of justice, Aquinas reminds us of the possibility of a merciful justice, a justice that welcomes, heals, and turns pain into salvation. Together, these three perspectives form a fascinating conversation. Theravada Buddhism says, suffering is the natural result of past actions, but liberation is possible right now through awareness and detachment. The Bhagavad Gita teaches, suffering fades when we act without attachment to results. The secret is how we stand in relation to action. Thomas Aquinas argues, suffering can carry moral and spiritual meaning, but it isn't automatic punishment. God's grace goes beyond karma. Three paths, three ways of seeing pain, action, and transcendence. And maybe they all point in the same direction. Suffering doesn't have to be the end. It can be part of a path of transformation, liberation, and union with something greater. The question that remains is, how are we acting? What are we planting with our thoughts, words, and attitudes? Are we trapped by outcomes or free to act with awareness? Because in the end, karma, whether understood as a moral law, a spiritual practice, or an existential reality, reminds us of something essential. We are responsible for what we do with pain, and also for what we do with what we do. Suffering hurts, but it also reveals. It reveals weakness, yes, but also strength, manipulation, strategy. Suffering may seem passive, but it can also become an instrument of power. It can be used to dominate, to maintain control, or even to reshape reality. In this lesson, we're going to dive into an uncomfortable and provocative idea: suffering as a tool of power. To explore that, we'll turn to three very different thinkers: Michel Foucault, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Sun Tzu. Each one shows, in their own way, that suffering isn't only the result of violence or injustice. It can also be a method, a resource used to shape behavior, control bodies, and even win battles. Let's begin with Michel Foucault, one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century, especially when it comes to power, institutions, and social control. For Foucault, suffering, especially physical and psychological suffering, has historically been used as a way to discipline people and force them into normal behavior. In Discipline and Punish, he analyzes the shift in how societies punish, from public torture to the modern prison system. In the past, suffering was a spectacle: executions, mutilations, public torture. The point was to display power through the body, creating fear. But over time, power became more subtle, more rational. Punishment left the town square and moved behind walls. Prisons, hospitals, schools, military barracks. Places where suffering was no longer displayed, but organized, controlled, calculated. Foucault shows that suffering didn't disappear, it was internalized. We began to suffer in invisible ways, shaping our behavior, bodies, desires, and thoughts, according to rules we often don't even question. He writes, "Power is not exercised only on the body, it penetrates the body." Suffering, then, is no longer just punishment. It becomes a training system for control. We learn to obey not because someone screams at us, but because we fear exclusion, shame, failure. Modern discipline turns suffering into routine: strict schedules, constant testing, evaluations, labels. All of it can create pain, and that pain shapes people. For Foucault, power isn't only repressive, it's productive. It creates types of individuals, and suffering sits at the center of that process. It teaches, limits, frames, and molds. This forces us to look more carefully at the systems we live inside. Are some forms of suffering not just inevitable, but actually desired, so the system can stay stable? Are some pains produced by the normal functioning of power itself? Foucault warns us, suffering can also be political management. This critique of suffering as a tool of control also appears, under a different tone, in Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher of the will to power. But Nietzsche goes further. He argues that suffering wasn't only used to control people, it was turned into a virtue. To explain this, he analyzes Christian morality. According to Nietzsche, Christianity reshaped suffering into something morally superior. In On the Genealogy of Morality, he presents the idea of slave morality, a value system created by those who were socially and politically oppressed. Without real power, they began to glorify suffering, humility, obedience, self-denial. Nietzsche writes, "Slave morality begins when resentment becomes creative. In other words, the weak, unable to defeat the strong, created a moral system that flips values upside down. Now being weak becomes pure. Being poor becomes virtuous. Suffering becomes holy. Meanwhile, the strong, the winners, the life affirmers, are labeled evil, arrogant, sinful." Nietzsche sees this as a power game. Suffering becomes a symbol of moral superiority, and that, he argues, paralyzes life. Because it turns pain into identity, into symbolic status. It creates guilt, crushes desire, weakens the spirit. Nietzsche doesn't deny suffering, but he says, don't use it as an excuse. Don't turn it into a moral crown. Pain needs to be overcome and transformed, not worshipped. Nietzsche proposes master morality, a way of living that affirms life, strength, creation, even in the face of pain. For him, suffering can make us stronger if we face it with courage and will. But if it becomes a passive virtue, then it becomes a prison. Like Foucault, Nietzsche exposes how suffering can be an instrument of control, only now, not through institutions, but through morality itself. Finally, we reach a more strategic, practical view, yet still deeply ethical. Sun Tzu, a Chinese general and thinker from the 5th century BC, author of The Art of War. For Sun Tzu, war may be inevitable, but it must be intelligent. And within that intelligence, suffering appears both as a weapon and as a danger. Sun Tzu recognizes that causing pain can destabilize the enemy. But he also recognizes that suffering weakens everyone. So the ideal is not to prolong suffering, it's to avoid it. He writes, To win 100 battles is not the height of excellence. The height of excellence is to defeat the enemy without fighting. In other words, true power isn't the power that destroys, it's the power that prevents destruction. The wisest victory is the one that reduces suffering on all sides. In Sun Tzu's view, suffering must be calculated, used only when necessary, as a last resort, always with a clear goal: to restore order, not to spread chaos. This perspective brings a rare balance. It doesn't romanticize pain, it doesn't deny its tactical use, but it values strategy that protects, preserves, and anticipates. In times of conflict, this reminds us, real strength isn't making others suffer, it's knowing when to prevent suffering. With Foucault, Nietzsche, and Sun Tzu, we get three ways of understanding how suffering can function as power. Foucault shows that suffering becomes discipline, internalized to shape behavior. Nietzsche reveals how suffering was turned into a moral value, creating a subtle form of cultural domination. Sun Tzu teaches that suffering can be strategic, but real power is winning with intelligence, without needing to inflict it. Together, they destroy the idea that suffering is only natural. They show that suffering can also be constructed, used, manipulated. And most importantly, it can be reduced, when freedom, clarity, and intelligence replace fear. In the end, the question isn't only why we suffer, it's also who benefits from our suffering, who profits from other people's pain, and how can we break this cycle using power not to harm, but to heal. When we say, "I'm suffering," it feels obvious that there's an I in there, stable, watching, separate from the pain. But what if that I isn't what we think it is? What if the thing we call the self is just a fragile mental construction, fluid, temporary, always changing? And what if suffering is fed by the illusion that there's someone permanent inside us who suffers? This is one of the deepest questions in philosophy and spirituality. Who is the self that suffers? Does it really exist? In this lesson, we'll explore how David Hume, the Buddha, and René Descartes dealt with that question. Three thinkers from different cultures and eras who invite us to look at suffering through the lens of identity, or the absence of it. Let's start with David Hume, an 18th century Scottish philosopher known for his radical empiricism and skeptical approach to the human mind. For Hume, the idea of a continuous fixed self that stays the same over time is an illusion. He writes, "When I look within myself, I never find this self. I only find a sequence of perceptions, feelings, thoughts, sensation, nothing more." In other words, for Hume, we are not a permanent substance. We are a bundle of temporary experiences, a stream of impressions that come and go like clouds in the sky. There isn't some observer self behind it all. There is only the flow of perception, and that has huge implications for suffering. If there is no fixed self, then suffering is also fragmented. It doesn't belong to a solid identity. It rises in certain moments of awareness, then fades. It's part of the stream, not something eternal, not something essential. Pain exists, yes. But what gives it its heavy weight is the belief that it belongs to someone, that I'm trapped in it, that this defines me. Hume breaks that idea apart. If all we have are passing experiences, then suffering is just one of them. Intense, but temporary. This view invites us to loosen our grip on pain, to understand it as part of the current of consciousness, not as an absolute truth about who we are. This idea echoes strongly in Buddhism, especially in the teachings of the Buddha, who lived more than 2,000 years before Hume and already proposed something very similar. The belief in a fixed self is the cause of suffering. According to the Buddha, we suffer because we believe there is a separate, permanent, solid self that needs to be protected, satisfied, and recognized. But that self isn't real. It's a mental construction, a collection of constantly changing processes, body, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. He taught, just as a chariot is only the collection of wheels, axles, and parts, so the self is only the collection of aggregates. There is no self behind the body and mind. And so, clinging to this illusion is living in constant conflict. We want the self to be loved, to never suffer, to last forever. But how can that happen if we ourselves are pure impermanence? Suffering is born from attachment to the self, from trying to preserve what cannot be preserved. Freedom comes when we understand this deeply, not just as an idea, but as direct experience. When we let go of the self, we also let go of the pain the self carries. This is the core of nirvana, the ending of the false ego, and with it, the ending of suffering. Like Hume, the Buddha does not deny the experience of pain, but he says it doesn't belong to a fixed entity. And once we see that, we create space for a lighter, more compassionate, freer relationship with suffering. But there is a thinker who went in the opposite direction, who strongly defended the existence of a real, deep, undeniable self. That thinker is René Descartes, a 17th century French philosopher, often seen as the father of modern rationalism. Descartes became famous for his search for absolute certainty, something that could not be doubted. And he found it, not in the body, not in the world, but in the mind. More specifically, in the act of thinking. His famous line sums it up: cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Even if everything is uncertain, the world, the senses, even the body, the fact that you doubt already proves there is an I that thinks, and that I becomes the starting point of all certainty. So for Descartes, suffering, even as doubt, pain, anxiety, confirms the existence of the subject. Even if everything collapses, something remains, the self that thinks. For many people, this is comforting. It offers an anchor. Yes, I suffer, but I exist. But unlike Hume and the Buddha, Descartes sees the self as a thinking substance, separate from the body, matter, and the world. So even if the body gets sick, even if the mind becomes confused, the self still remains as pure awareness. This model deeply shaped Western thought, the idea of a continuous personal identity that can be known, protected, and developed. But it also created a dilemma. If the self is separate from the world, how do we deal with the pain that comes from the world? If the self is a substance, then suffering becomes something that hits it from the outside, something you have to fight against. While for the Buddha suffering dissolves when the ego dissolves, for Descartes suffering confirms that the ego is real. They are opposite views, but they show how deep this question goes. With Hume, we learn that the self is just a flow of perceptions, so suffering can also be seen as temporary, not as identity. With the Buddha, we see that attachment to the self is the root of pain, and letting go of that illusion is the path to freedom. With Descartes, we see that the thinking self is the one certainty, even in doubt, even in pain. Three ways of looking at the same experience. Suffering as a question of who we are. Because maybe what makes us suffer isn't only pain itself, but the belief that there's a separate someone suffering. Someone who must win, resist, protect themselves, prove themselves against time, against others, against impermanence itself. But what if that someone is only an image? What if the self is a story repeated again and again, but never truly solid? Maybe, when we look more closely, suffering becomes smaller as the self dissolves. Or as Hume might say, when we realize there is no fixed self to carry the pain, it passes like everything else. Or as the Buddha taught, to be free from the self is to be free from suffering. Or as Descartes would insist, even if everything disappears, the thinking self is still here. The choice between these views is yours, but the invitation is the same. Look inward, watch the self that suffers, and ask, is it really as solid as it seems? How do you express pain? How do you put into words something that burns deep in your chest? that tears you apart inside, that makes you feel like you can't breathe. Some pain we can explain, others we can only feel. Suffering often spills beyond the limits of language, but it can also be trapped by silence, and that's when it becomes even more unbearable. In this lesson, we're going to reflect on the relationship between suffering and language, what can be said, what has been silenced, and what can be transformed through the power of words. Through three thinkers from different traditions, Wittgenstein, Simone de Beauvoir, and Kukai, we'll explore how language can both bring light to pain and reveal its limits. Let's begin with Ludwig Wittgenstein, one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century, known for his work on language, meaning, and silence. Wittgenstein saw language as something that shapes the world. He believed the limits of language are the limits of our world. In other words, we can only think and speak about what can be named, described, and clearly expressed. But what about suffering? Does it fit into words? In Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, Wittgenstein wrote, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." It sounds harsh, but it carries a deep idea. Some human experiences go beyond language, and suffering, at its most intense, is one of them. You can say, "I'm sad," "I'm in pain," "I lost someone." But none of those sentences, no matter how true, can fully transmit what it feels like. Language fails. It gets close, but it never fully reaches it. Wittgenstein isn't saying we should stop talking about pain. He's saying we need to recognize this truth. There's a limit to what language can communicate. There's a part of suffering that can only be lived, and maybe only shared through silence or through real presence. And that teaches us humility. Not all pain can be explained, and not all silence is empty. Sometimes, silence is the only space deep pain can exist in. But the problem isn't only what language can't say. Sometimes, the real problem is what language doesn't allow to be said. Sometimes the problem is the historical silencing of certain kinds of pain, especially the pain of marginalized groups. That's where Simone de Beauvoir comes in, existentialist philosopher, writer, and pioneer of feminist thought. For Beauvoir, women's suffering was erased, ignored, and dismissed throughout history. Women suffered, physically, emotionally, and existentially, in silence because they were never given room to speak. In The Second Sex, she wrote, "Man is the subject, woman is the other." That sentence reveals something huge. The world was built, written, and spoken from a male point of view. Women's experiences, including their pain, were often minimized or mocked. Simone de Beauvoir saw language as both a tool of domination and a tool of freedom. Whoever controls language controls what can or cannot be said, and therefore what can or cannot be publicly recognized. Giving voice to women's suffering is, for her, both a philosophical and political act. Talking openly about forced motherhood, domestic violence, harassment, loneliness, inequality, everything that was hidden, becomes a way of claiming the right to fully exist. And even more than that, it shows that suffering is not neutral. It's shaped by power. To silence a group is to make their pain look invisible, when in reality, it is painfully real. Beauvoir reminds us that naming pain is often the first step toward overcoming it. Language can be a weapon, but it can also be healing. But what if language is not only rational, philosophical, or political? What if it can also be spiritual? What if there are forms of language that aren't meant to explain pain, but to move beyond it? That's where Kukai enters the conversation, 9th century Japanese monk and founder of the Shingon school of esoteric Buddhism. For Kukai, language isn't just communication, it's sacred energy. In his view, words, syllables, and sounds have spiritual power. That's why mantras, sacred sounds repeated with deep focus, are central in his practice. But what does that have to do with suffering? For Kukai, mental suffering, anxiety, attachment, fear, confusion comes from ignorance about the true nature of reality. Like Buddhism in general, this ignorance causes us to build a separate self. a rigid ego that clings and fights against change. In this context, mantras become tools to dissolve that ignorance. They work directly on the mind, the body, and the breath, creating a state of awareness where the ego loosens, and with it, suffering begins to fade. Kukai believed sacred language can align the practitioner with the Dharma, the deeper truth of existence. It's not about understanding, it's about experiencing. A mantra isn't something you explain, it's something you live, and when you live it, it transforms you. This is a radical use of language, not to describe pain, not to expose it, but to transcend it. Words become a path, a bridge, a medicine. So while Wittgenstein points to the limits of language, Kukai reveals its spiritual power. While Beauvoir speaks about the urgent need to give voice to silenced pain, Kukai invites us into the quiet vibration of sacred sound. With these three thinkers, we get three ways to understand the connection between suffering and language. Wittgenstein warns us, part of suffering escapes words, and maybe only silence, art, or real compassion can touch it. Simone de Beauvoir exposes something crucial. Some suffering was silenced by history, and giving it a voice is an act of justice, freedom, and rebuilding the world. Kukai shows another side. Some words heal, some sounds purify. Language can also be spiritual, a channel for dissolving suffering through sacred vibration. Three paths, three ways of speaking, or not speaking, about pain. And all of them bring us to the same essential question. How do we name our pain? Are we trapped in silence? Trapped in words that never fully reach it? Or have we found a language that sets us free? Because in the end, suffering needs space, whether in sound, in a cry, in silence, in a mantra, in a text, or in a single look. Language doesn't heal everything, but it can open doors. And sometimes, one honest word is the beginning of transformation. Suffering is unavoidable, but does it mean anything? That's one of the most urgent questions a person can ask. Because when pain shows up, it doesn't just hurt your body or your heart, it threatens the meaning of existence itself. The question isn't only, why does it hurt? It's also, what for? Some people find purpose in suffering, like it's a mission. Others try to avoid it as much as possible, chasing a calmer life. And some people wonder if it even makes sense to look for meaning in everything. In this final lesson, we'll explore three answers to this search through Viktor Frankl, Epicurus, and Laozi. Three different, but deeply human ways of facing pain and the mystery of life. Let's begin with Viktor Frankl, an Austrian psychiatrist, the founder of logotherapy, and a survivor of Nazi concentration camps. Few people have spoken about suffering with as much authority as he did. In his book, Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl describes the horrors he lived through in Auschwitz, and how even in those inhuman conditions, some prisoners managed to hold on to dignity, and others didn't. What made the difference? According to him, it was the ability to find meaning, even in extreme pain. Frankl wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." That line, inspired by Nietzsche, sums up his view. Suffering by itself doesn't destroy you. What destroys you is the absence of meaning. And that meaning doesn't have to come from outside. It's a personal task. Even when facing loss, injustice, and death, we can still choose how to respond. And that choice is already an act of freedom. Frankl noticed that the people who could survive psychologically in the camps were often the ones who had something to live for. A child waiting for them, a dream not finished yet, faith, a purpose, an ideal, something bigger than the pain of that moment. But Frankl also makes something very clear. It's not suffering that gives meaning to life. It's the human being who gives meaning to suffering. And that's a powerful message. Even when we can't control what happens to us, we can still choose who we become in response to it. Frankl doesn't romanticize pain. He turns it into an existential calling. Suffering is not noble by itself, but suffering with purpose can lift us up. Now let's go to the opposite side of this experience. People who don't wait for suffering to arrive and hit them. people who try to prevent it from the start. That's the case with Epicurus, a Greek philosopher from ancient times who is often misunderstood. A lot of people assume Epicurus preached pleasure at any cost. But his philosophy was much more subtle than that. He taught that true happiness comes from reducing suffering. And you do that by living a simple, balanced life without excess. Epicurus believed human suffering comes mostly from two things: fear and desire. Fear of death, fear of the gods, fear of the future, desire for wealth, status, endless pleasure. Both create a restless mind, anxious, tense, never satisfied. And that inner agitation is what causes pain. That's why Epicurus recommended a life based on moderation and self-awareness. Eating well, building real friendships, pursuing wisdom, avoiding unnecessary stress. That was his way of living well. He wrote, "If you want to be rich, do not add to your possessions, but subtract from your desires." For Epicurus, you don't need big cosmic meanings to live well. You just need the steady, lasting pleasure of inner peace. And that peace comes from balance, reason, and accepting the nature of life. So for him, suffering isn't a teacher. It's a sign that something is out of alignment. And the philosopher's job is to restore harmony. His view invites you into a lighter, more realistic kind of life. Less heroic than Frankl's, but maybe more reachable in everyday life. Because sometimes, the meaning of life is found in a quiet moment of calm. And finally, we have a third approach, even more radical, coming from the East. The thought of Laozi, author of the Tao Te Ching, one of the foundational texts of Taoism. Laozi tells us something unsettling. Trying to find meaning in everything is a trap. Life doesn't need to be explained. It needs to be lived in harmony with the Tao, the natural flow of the universe. In this view, suffering shows up when we resist that flow, when we try to control, understand, or dominate what simply is. He wrote, "Those who know do not speak. Those who speak do not know." That line, typical of Taoism's mysterious style, carries a paradoxical wisdom. The more we force meaning onto life, the more we move away from its essence. The Tao can't be fully explained. It has to be felt. Pain is part of it. Joy is part of it too. Both move like water, and the wise person is the one who moves with it. Laozi invites us to loosen our grip, to let go of the obsession with answers, and to find freedom in accepting impermanence. This isn't passive surrender. It's a confident surrender to the mystery, a deep trust that life has its rhythm, its balance, even when we don't understand it. So suffering stops being a mistake and becomes part of the path. It doesn't need to be defeated or fully explained, only accepted as part of the Tao. With Viktor Frankl, we see that suffering can be carried with personal meaning, and that meaning can make us stronger. With Epicurus, we learn that we can avoid a lot of pain by living with moderation and wisdom. And with Laozi, we discover that the search for meaning can be dropped, and that living in harmony with the flow of existence is enough by itself. 3 answers, 3 paths, 3 ways of dealing with pain, each in its own way. For Frankl, pain becomes dignity when it has purpose. For Epicurus, pain becomes avoidable when we live intelligently. For Laozi, pain is natural, and it loses power when we move with life instead of fighting it. And you? Are you searching for a reason behind your pain, or trying to escape it? Or maybe you're ready to accept it as part of the road. Maybe life doesn't offer one single answer. Maybe meaning isn't waiting at the end of the road. Maybe it's in the way we keep walking, even when it hurts. Because in the end, maybe the real question isn't, what is the meaning of suffering? But, who do I become when I choose to live, even with it? If you made it this far, it's because you had the courage to face pain head on. The courage to think, to feel, and to question. And that alone is already a kind of transformation. I hope each one of these lessons reached you in some way, whether it brought you relief, sparked reflection, or lit a new kind of understanding about yourself and the world. But this journey doesn't end here. If you enjoyed this content, hit like. It really helps the channel grow and makes it easier for more people to find these ideas. Comment down below. Which lesson impacted you the most? Do you connect more with Frankl's view, Buddha's, Nietzsche's, or someone else we talked about today? Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes one idea can change someone's day, or even their life. And of course, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos. There's a lot more philosophy, meaning, critical thinking, and real human insight coming your way. Stay here with us. Check out the other videos on the channel. Each one is an invitation to think deeper and live with more awareness. Thank you so much for being here. I'll see you in the next video. See you soon.